All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the October FMDiSC meeting. It's good to see people here from all over the world. We're going to dive into our first presentation, which is with Anton Anderson. This presentation actually came out of a conversation Anton and I were having about all the new terms that are being used as we start to learn about sort of where the direction our FileMaker is going. And collectively, we thought it would be a good idea just to sort of dive into some of those terms and bring everyone up to level on what some of them mean and what the potential implications are for us as FileMaker developers. So with that, I'll hand it over to Anton. You should be able to share your screen.
Fantastic. All right, let me.
All right, thanks, Anton. Everyone, please, if you're not already, mute yourself. And if you want, you can turn off video just to preserve bandwidth.
All right, can you guys see that?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. So, as Jonathan was saying, part of the whole thing, this conversation came about from the whole idea of trying to figure out, at the different presentations, things like that. Whenever there's new things going on, sometimes there's new terminology and new technology is being announced, and so we kind of like, wait, what does that mean? What are some of the specifics with that? And so that's the title of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to do my best to demystify some upcoming FileMaker technologies. Things are part of the new stuff, as they call it. Let me get this to go. I have to click, I guess. And so my name is Anton Anderson. My company's Productivity Consulting. I've been around for a while. I'm a FileMaker developer, Claris developer. My main business offering is that of a fractional CTO, fractional CIO, which, it's alphabet soup. And so what that really means is that I help business leaders make better technology decisions. And, it's funny when Brad and Peter and Wes were talking about, and Andy during the keynote about we want to get to people who are in college and things like that. Well, I'm actually one of those people. I study computer science major, but I actually started using FileMaker in college. Discovered it in college. It was cheap back then, and funny enough, I needed a tool to build my pledge book when I joined a fraternity, and so I needed a database. Because computer science geek, I needed a database to be able to do that, and so because I just had to, and so I've been using FileMaker actually since undergrad. I've been around the community for a while. Been part of the FMDiSC board, a few things like that. I gotta always, it's been. I was really devastated to hear about my dear friend Shin, so I want to give a quick shout out to her. So I've been around the community for a while. Actually, I've been around just long enough to where, back when FileMaker Advisor was published on paper, I wrote a number of articles for them and was one of the technical editors for the Advisor Basics, partly because I really like the idea, and I'm so happy that Claris is going in this direction of really coming back to making it easy to enter, more approachable for people. And so that was one of the things that I was involved in, was helping to make some of the more complex things simple for people who are getting started. But as Todd mentioned earlier, it's been a while since I presented. The last time I presented was on JSON, and my son could barely walk, and now he's in kindergarten right now, and he's got a little sister who also can barely walk. So maybe there's a little bit of synergies there. So what we're going to talk about is I want to sort of follow up on some of the things that were mentioned during the keynote and during the executive Q&A. When they did that, it was a great presentation. I'm really glad that they're opening up to give us more stuff, but they dropped a whole lot of different concepts and different terminologies. And my hope today is to talk a little bit more about that, explain a little bit, and hopefully make it to where maybe you won't necessarily memorize all of it or feel like, oh, I've got my head completely wrapped around it, but at least you'll have a sense of what's being discussed, where it's coming from, what's sort of being talked about as we go along. So I need to give an important caveat. So my caveat is, especially for those of you who have been living in these platforms for a long time, I'm going to oversimplify. well, I'm going to sort of treat you guys kind of like a notably more technical version of one of my clients. I'm going to try to give some broad concepts, but I am going to oversimplify. So you'll be like, hey, well, wait a minute, what about that? There's a nuance that you're blowing past. I'm blowing past those nuances. So let's go back. So one thing that, and we talked about it a little bit during the sort of the pre-conversation that we started off talking about was NoSQL. And Beverly, you mentioned it too. It's like, well, what does that mean? What the heck does that mean? Does it mean there's no, some people think about SQL, obviously standing for structured query language, and it's like, what do you mean? There's no query? There's no structure? The world's coming to end. Cats and dogs living together, that kind of thing. And that's obviously not true. There is a query language. It does have a structure to it. For those of you who have ever done ESS join or anything like that, you've been able. It wouldn't look too unfamiliar. Different, but not too unfamiliar. Instead, where this comes from is when you think about SQL, really kind of shorthand for relational database. And so, one definition when you think of NoSQL databases is really more along the lines of a non-relational database, a database that doesn't use the sort of normal relational model that we're so accustomed to now. Also, some people say, well, it's not only SQL, because it isn't necessarily black or white, and there's some hybrids that are out there. So let's try to compare the two, and then I'm hoping you guys can come away with a bit of an equivalency, a bit of a mapping, if you will, between the two. So relational database, we all know it. It's tables and columns and rows and joins and relationships between them. And it's all the stuff that we're all familiar with. And so a NoSQL database is essentially, quite frankly, everything that's not that, right? So, even like a flat file, Excel file, is NoSQL, is a NoSQL database, once again, oversimplifying a bit. In most cases, and there's like 3 or 4 major types, there's graphs and documents, and most of them generally are formed with these key value pairs. And you see it looks kind of like JSON, but pretty understandable, pretty straightforward, first name, a value, last name, another value. And so it's so there is a structure. It's not complete chaos. And what's cool about this is it's actually pretty lightweight. So a lot of Internet of Things devices store their data using a NoSQL database, using this very compact, very lightweight way of storing the data, and it's very flexible. You don't need to spin up an instance of some big thing to especially if it's something that's being powered by like a AA battery or something. You want to be able to have the ability to capture data in an easy way, but one that can scale up too. On the relational side, we all, these are just a handful of the players. We've, MySQL, Microsoft, Oracle, of course, FileMaker. On the relational side, there are some other players too. Oracle, Microsoft also have a presence there. Google Big Tables, a NoSQL database. Amazon, DynamoDB. FoundationDB, which is that we were mentioning earlier, was bought by Apple, and then they released it back as an open source product. It's a back end for many of Apple's cloud services, and so that's interesting that they actually chose MongoDB for the new stuff. And so I think that's an interesting thing there. Most of my examples coming up are going to be basically based on MongoDB, and so we'll go a little bit more into that. So in a relational database, you have your table there, right? And MongoDB is a flavor of a NoSQL database called a document-oriented database, which means that the main model, the main type is.
23 Jahre ist sie alt und muss ihr Leben leben. Mit 687.
So the main object type there is obviously a document-oriented database. So think of a document as being like a record, okay? And so within that, you have this text, you have this information there. It looks like JSON, but really it's what's called BSON, binary JSON, which means you can hold all kinds of things. As I was actually looking into this in depth, specifically with MongoDB, lots of different data types. With JSON, it's generally kind of like a string, a number, just a limited number of data types. But one of the interesting supported data types in MongoDB is latitude and longitude is a supported data type, and I think that's going to be really interesting. It's a whole different conversation. But when you start thinking about things being mobile and things being on mobile portable devices, being able to do all the stuff that we're used to doing in a database, but have it be, giving everyone within a certain radius of this location. I think it's really interesting. I think it has some interesting implications there of that being a supported data type, natively inside the database. Anyway, so it maps pretty easily. Here's your ID. You've got your key field over there in the table. You've got your first name, last name. You've got status. It all maps pretty easily. So you've got these key value pairs, which are the equivalent of your fields. And so if the key value pairs are your fields and document is your record, well, then what's the table? You've got all these documents kind of floating around. Well, that's sort of this concept called a collection, where you've got a collection of these documents all together, and that's essentially the equivalent of your table. That all sounds good, pretty straightforward, right? But then what happens when you want to do something more sophisticated? When you want to, sort of take it, do something more useful than just a single table? And what happens when you want to integrate other information? Obviously customers' invoices. We've all done this, a million times. And it's not a big leap, obviously, to think about, well, I can maybe take that one record, my one related record, in my one-to-many relationship, and turn it into this whole sort of JSON, BSON looking thing. I got my my ID and my customer ID and the date and everything else. But then the question is like, where does it go? And here's where it gets interesting. You put it in the document. And so as you can see here, you just embed it. It's just another embedded piece of information straight into the document. And so, in my middle example, or my far left example, you have the basic record with no attached data. In the middle, I have one record, one invoice that is associated with that customer. And then on the right, I have a couple of them, so I could keep going on and on and on and on. And when you look at that, you're like, wait a minute, this is all kind of moving around, and I've just changed. Imagine if you were in a flat system, you need to add columns. We've all done this, where our client, our customer says, oh, I need you to add a field, and they're kind of like, oh, well, that kind of breaks things and doing stuff. But here, you just insert it in. When they're talking about schema free, this is kind of what they're talking about, being able to sort of insert things in there. There actually is a schema, and to me, the schema always speaks to structure and some consistency and some intelligibility to the data. And so I like to call it, more of a flexible schema. And so what's great about that is that you can then add in all kinds of stuff. And so you can have like birthdays, or you can have my middle example, their interests, and maybe a middle initial. So you can have this dynamic set of fields a dynamic set of data that's stored in each document, and each document, each record, if you will, in your customer's file doesn't necessarily have to all have the same data, and doesn't necessarily have to have a null value where, you don't have to have we all have done this. We've all had, spare fields in our table saying, well, we don't want to have to, change and define new fields. And so here it's all very, very flexible. Now, if you're looking at this, you're looking at yourself going, wait a minute, these are all different, but they are all part of the customer table. So wait a minute, and you're probably, at least for some of you've got like your spidey sense going off, going, well, wait a minute, you've denormalized the data, dun, dun, dun. I've denormalized my data. And yes, you have. And you might look at that and you're like, well, wait a minute, why on earth would I want to do that to myself? How am I going to get anything done? How is this going to work? Why would I want to denormalize the data? Well, here's why. Because it's fast. We've all had in FileMaker, you build your solution, and then you've got like your child record, in a portal, and then they've got grandchild records, and you do something there, and the minute you hit that layout, it's slow, right? Because you have to go down the relationship and knit one, purl two, all the way down. Whereas here, once you have the record, you have the whole shebang, potentially. You could have, all that information all at once. You get the whole thing. And so it's fast. So you have something that's fast, and then we already talked about something that's being flexible. One, that plays into the whole notion of agile development because you can change things. One of the challenges that we have in relational databases and as FileMaker developers is that we are all, once you have your schema kind of locked in, you're a little hesitant to change it because there are issues you don't want to make sure you don't want to break anything, and so you got this flexible schema that's then fast. And then MongoDB was built in the 21st century. It's scalable, right? So it's designed from the beginning to be scalable, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And so that sort of thing lends itself to the cloud solutions. And we happen to know a company that is really going with a cloud-first strategy, right? We all know who that is. And so it makes sense that these NoSQL databases, this sort of a technology would be applied in this case. So let me talk for a little bit about scalability. And I'm going to be a little hyperbolic here. I've had some caffeine. We've all done this. In a relational database, FileMaker database, you deploy it, and you're kind of just getting started, and the scope is pretty small, and then people start using it and get excited about it, and things start happening, and so you're like, oh well, yeah, we'll upgrade and we'll do some things, and then more people are using it. It becomes more of a business critical thing, and it's scale, and you're trying to scale it up, and you're kind of like, well, what are we gonna do? On-prem, throw more hardware at it. We're really going to get serious this time, and so then you put a real server there, but you can't do that forever, right? There's a limit. I remember Dave showed this incredible rig, and this is not the right picture, but this giant thing that the most powerful FileMaker database you can have out there, and but there's a limit, and so then at that point you have to then replicate onto a different server, and then you have synchronization issues, and how do you make all that work? Well, in Mongo and with most of the non-SQL databases, NoSQL databases, they're designed to run on commodity hardware, and they're designed to be distributed. So when you need more power, throw another server on there, and it all kind of works out. Need more? Get another server. What's even better about that is that not only do you have more power, more capacity, but then you have failover. So that way, if one of the machines fails, because it's a commodity machine, so you have mirrors and things, so so what? It's kind of much like for databases, what we see on the hardware side when you talk about RAID drives, redundant array of independent disks or inexpensive disks, where if one of those drives fails, you get a red light. Yes, redundant array of independent computers. One of those machines fails, and you get a warning, a notification, and you kind of move on. So you just keep going and keep adding on. And MongoDB and other NoSQL databases like it, are designed to scale that way. And what that also means is that you can also move these and have these be wherever you want. And so they don't always have to be in one monolithic data center. Part of the reason why you see a lot of these cloud guys using these NoSQL databases. You can move your data so that way when your data comes in, you can then move that data to where it's close to your customers, reducing latency and things like that. But this brings me to another thing I want to talk about, and I realize I'm talking too fast. I had too much caffeine. I'm going to use up. I'm going to go fast, Jonathan. So tell Todd to be ready, or we'll have a break or something. So one of the things that was brought up during the Q&A was this notion of eventual consistency, and that's another one of those terms. Just like when they say NoSQL, it makes you like, well, wait, what do you mean? It's supposed to be a database. It's supposed to be consistent. What the heck does that mean? And if you think about it, you've got this distributed system, this distributed database, right? And you have these documents, so they're all very discretely sort of packaged up with each record. And so then someone enters it, and they're wherever they are. But then you've got to do something with it. It doesn't necessarily end up and doesn't necessarily belong on that server. A whole different conversation, like where do the different documents live? You can do a hashing function that says it goes on server A versus server B versus server C. So that way you distribute the load. This system is designed. These NoSQL databases, Mongo in particular, designed to distribute the data in a way that follows your protocol. So you save the data to the server, whatever's closest to you, whatever you're connected to. But then it has to go to a backup, and it goes to a mirror, and then eventually goes to where it belongs. And all of that takes time. Usually, we're talking about a couple milliseconds, not very long at all. But that's what they mean when they say eventually consistent. Unlike what we see in FileMaker databases, where it's like live. People are changing things, and the changes are instantaneous because they're all connected to one thing. Well, because it's all distributed, you eventually get consistent. But one of the benefits there is it's a trade-off. But one of the benefits is that you then, you can reduce latency by moving the data near the person. But also you've got this redundancy and this mirroring capability. And so and that brings me to trade-offs. When you trade-offs between relational databases, MongoDB and NoSQL databases, you do have this eventual consistency, which is a little bit different concept, and you have to kind of wrap your head around it. On the other hand, there are trade-offs for relational databases. They're computationally intensive. I mean, you got to throw a lot of hardware to make some of these things go, to do some of these things. Interestingly enough, in NoSQL databases, there's no joins. And you're like, well, wait, what the heck does that mean? It means that your data, as you saw earlier, is all sort of packaged together. Trade-off of that is that for certain types of calculations and certain types of summaries and things, you have to do a little bit more work to get that to work properly. Unlike a relational database where you have a strict schema, those sorts of things, you do have joins, and so those sorts of summarizations and those type of reporting and output of the data, it's blazingly fast. It's really very straightforward, and so it's a trade-off. Without that strict schema, you're going to end up having a little bit more redundancy. You're going to have, as they mentioned during the keynote, you'll have bits of data not only in different documents, so you've got some things here and some things there, but also you'll have bits of data that may be distributed all over the place because maybe you're doing some aggregation, you're doing some optimizations. So that way you can take care of mitigate the issue of no joins, and so you move some of that data around, and so you end up using up more space. And the good news is that right now in modern era, storage is cheap. So you can do that. You can have a little bit more of a heavyweight thing. On the other side, relational databases, you have storage is actually very efficient. With the normalized data and with tables. But anyone who's ever done any kind of an export, especially if you're even something as simple as an export to Excel or to anything else, we've all done this object mapping where we take all these related tables and then having to bring it back into one row because we're pushing something in or we're pulling data in using an API, and then we have to burst it out into all of its relative tables. So you have object mapping back and forth, and actually you don't have to do that in these NoSQL databases, at least the ones that we're talking about here, because it follows an object model. The document is the object, and so especially with object-oriented languages like JavaScript, it works pretty well. It's pretty seamless in that regard. And so you don't have to do this sort of mapping across your parent table and child table, etc. For both of them, there's things making sure the database, actually works. All these ACID concerns. We've had actually other sessions here at FMDiSC, a very, very oversimplified version of ACID. Atomicity, consistency, isolation, durability. Really, what I tell my clients, when they talk about that, I'm like, well, they'll be in a meeting with IT or something like, it's an ACID database. I'm like, will the database do what it's supposed to do? When you do a transaction, does it stick? If the power goes out, does the database retain its integrity? For a while, NoSQL databases were given a hard time. Had some challenges in terms of making sure that all that would work, partly because of the distributed nature of it. But in MongoDB in particular, they've mitigated a lot of those things, and then on the relational side, there's things you need to mitigate, but you have to manage it in both cases. So when we talk about relational databases, specifically for FileMaker developers, we're talking about the Draco engine, right? And Claris has said explicitly, that the Draco engine's not going away. And there's this notion of ESS Plus that will let you move data back and forth. And to me, I think that's really exciting, because then you get to have the best of both worlds. I mean, one, all our solutions don't break, but also you get some of the benefits and some of the knowledge that already exists, some of the best practices that are already out there with relational databases, things that we all know how to do, are available. And then you have the scalability and the possibilities and the new data types that are available in these NoSQL databases, and the flexibility. To me, that's actually really exciting, because how many times have we all done a solution and then, as we're deploying, the client's like, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you about, it needs to serve up a beef Wellington at the end of every quarter, and you're kind of like, wait a minute, I don't have fields for a beef Wellington. So, having that flexibility, oh, but that's only a one-off case, and you're like, oh, what do you mean it's only a one-off case? And so having that flexibility, and then having that data set then be available to to your relational, your more traditional database, I think is really great. There's a lot. I mean, I'm going too fast, but I'm also really giving a very high-level view of what's going on here with the NoSQL databases and with Mongo in particular. If you're at all curious and will sort of want to go sort of bare metal into it, you can go to MongoDB.com, and they have two different ways in which you can interact with a MongoDB. They have a free online portal to it, MongoDB Atlas, but you can also install it, command line, install it on your computer, your Linux machine, your Windows machine, your Mac. And it's actually really cool. I've actually had some fun exploring it, because when you log on, you're expecting oh, where do I have to define my fields and define my tables, and it's actually really incredible once you're running MongoDB on your machine and you say, I want to use a database called FMDiSC. What if you don't have a database called FMDiSC? Well, MongoDB doesn't care. It's like it's like a honey badger. It's like MongoDB doesn't care. It just does it, and it says, sure, you're using a database called FMDiSC. What now? Well, I want to write these fields. And it says, okay. So it will actually immediately create the record and create the document, and then create the database. It kind of does it as you go. And so it's a bit of a mind-bending model, because it just kind of follows you wherever you go. And suddenly you're making all these things, and you suddenly have them. And they're available to use. And so extremely flexible. Really, I'm looking forward to exploring it a lot more. But I think you'll have some, for those of you who are inclined to, I think you'll have some fun with it, because it's pretty slick. Now, MongoDB is just sort of a piece of the whole pie here. So I want to jump back and abstract a little bit and talk about a couple of other things that were mentioned during the Q&A that sort of apply, not necessarily specifically to MongoDB. So let's go back. So let's go back for a moment and talk about, sort of like a cloud database platform of some flavor. It has all the attributes that we've talked about. It's distributed. It's on different servers, different data centers, kind of spread all around. And so you have all these databases there, all these documents that are there on each one. And that's great, right? Distributed, low latency, all that stuff. But what happens, what do you do when they all belong to different customers, different people? And that's where you get the whole notion of multi-tenancy. When they've talked about, you heard during the presentation that they talked about multi-tenancy, a multi-tenant environment. And there's a couple different flavors of that, but we're all familiar with one flavor in particular. If you've ever used shared hosting with some of our wonderful colleagues there, you've been in a multi-tenant environment. You're sharing in that particular type of multi-tenancy. You're sharing a single instance of the software. So if you're on a shared server, you've got one instance of FileMaker server. You're sharing the infrastructure, hard drive space and all that jazz. And you're kind of isolated. You're isolated enough. You want good passwords and that sort of thing. And obviously, you can do other examples of multi-tenancy when you spin up an AWS slice. Any of those things. Those are all considered multi-tenancy, right? And the apartment metaphor largely holds for that. Where you've got you're sharing resources. You're able to have some economies of scale that you wouldn't have otherwise. Now, one of the other things they talked about was this whole notion of containerization and containerized. And so I want to bring a little bit of contrast to those two things. Container is really a complete instance of the application. So whereas earlier we were talking about sort of everyone sort of being on the same, database server, the same FileMaker server. Imagine having a complete instance where like the whole install of MongoDB or whatever it is, there being its own thing. And so all the libraries, everything you need to run that solution is there inside the container. Now, that's different from a virtual machine, a VM, in the sense that a virtual machine is usually includes like the operating system and the hard drive and the storage and memory and all these things that are being abstracted on top of a hardware layer. And a container is not that. It's much more lightweight. It's just what you need to just the pieces you need to be able to run that solution, to run that application. And what's great about that is that it scales really fast, because then you have this container and then you say, okay, let's say you build a solution and you need to deploy it. Well, you want to deploy it something worldwide. You can just break off, spin off copies of this container and then distribute them around. You could also say, well, we need to run a special app for onboarding a new employee or doing some sort of data intake. Well, you can spin up a container, that's already sort of set up, and then immediately deploy that as its own thing. And then when you're done, you bring it back and you kind of take it down. And so containers can scale very rapidly, and they're very, very modular. And they're also portable. I like my little container ship metaphor here. Shout out to the MongoDB people who took their part. But it's also portable, and so one of the nice things about the container is that because it has all the libraries, all the specific pieces that are needed, you can move it. You can move it from one server to another, but also you can move it from one environment to another. So when they're talking about a containerized instance of MongoDB, it's not necessarily being forced to only run on AWS. It can run maybe in Google Cloud, or you can run on-prem. You can do all these different things because the container has all the pieces that you need, and then there's some hooks that will then let it tap into the infrastructure. And so that, of course, implies that you can also be multi-tenant with it, because you can have multiple containers, being on one host, like AWS or Google Cloud. But also you could have microservices. You could have multiple containers that are doing their own thing, servicing separate people. And so it's much more of a modern concept. And I think it's really interesting, the fact that they're able to take advantage of that. And I'm excited to see where that's going to go. Containerized. So we're talking about a cloud. I'm beginning to wrap up. I told you, Jonathan, I was going too fast, too much caffeine. Just to begin to wrap up, so when we talk about cloud database platforms, you'll hear them talk about a NoSQL backend, and really one of the main hallmarks about it is that it's flexible. So you can have not only agile development on their end, but also agile development on our end. So as developers, we can do things very fast, and they can scale and go fast, be performant, at scale. They can be containerized, so that way they can then be moved and positioned or instantiated in multiple ways, deployed in multiple ways, so you get some flexibility with how things are deployed. And then multi-tenant, meaning that you can have more than one. It means you don't have to necessarily stand up your own individual server, and you can have multiple things in there. You can sort of share the space, if you will. So those are some terms that you'll hear when we talk about the cloud platform. Now, the one thing we don't know is, what's it going to be called? That's still the big mystery. What the new stuff is going to be. So, I'm really going to kind of wrap up. I'd like to open it up to a more general discussion. I'd like to hear what you guys thought of this session. I've been just sort of sharing some of my thoughts. I see a question there in the chat, which I'll jump to in just a second. But before I open it up to discussion, I really just wanted to thank you all. Thank you for letting me be here to present to you guys. Right now, as I mentioned briefly at the very beginning, I spend a lot of time in Parentlandia, but I'm always happy to keep in touch. Anton at proconsult.com. And with that, I'd like to hand it back to you, Jonathan, and let's discuss and see what else other people had to say about it.
Thank you, Anton. That was great. That was really gives us all, I think, a good sort of foundation, a good overview of what some of these new terms are, one of these new technologies can do. I actually had a couple of questions I'll kick off with, and then we'll open it up for discussion for everyone. When you show that example, and look, I should say, we don't expect you to necessarily have all the answers because you're just learning this stuff as we are. But so one of the things that occurred to me when you showed that example of, the contact database or the company database, right, where each record, each document was a record that was a person, but then there were the invoices on the one person's record. My first thought was, oh, well, that's basically just a reference to another document that's the invoice. It's just the foreign key, basically, of the invoice document. And then each invoice would be its own document. But you also showed like a little more information. I don't know if that was just for illustrative purposes, where it said, the invoice date and the invoice amount. So the question is, would you store like all of the invoice information on the person's document record? Or we're used to thinking about it obviously as, oh, there's a table of invoices, and you could have basically, like I said, a reference to, or a join table in our case, probably.
I was looking into that because it was one of the things for me is that going back truly to undergrad and learning SQL back in the day on the old machines, I've always been thinking this relational model, and this is sort of where my training, all my education comes from. And so I kind of went down the path with that a little bit to figure out sort of like, well, what does that really mean, and what do you do? And so in my example, where I showed some of that basic information on that invoice assigned to the customer record, it really depends on what the use case is. It depends on what the business case is. So, and you see, and the thing is, you actually, a lot of these NoSQL databases are already deployed out into on the web, and so that's sort of the back end for a lot of these things. And you see it all the time, whether you say, oh, look at my purchase history, and it says, oh, you had purchase A, B, C, D, E, and it was for X number of dollars, whatever. And then yes, thank you, Colleen, for the data modeling. I enjoyed reading that. But then when you want to see more, you then click. And so you have to do a transaction, an interaction with the system to then say see more. And then, excuse me, then you can go down to that child record, right? But, it's very fast, very performant to get that basic information. What's my purchase history? Bang, you don't have to go down the chain to get it.
Right.
Because it's all there. You get the whole thing all at once.
Right. And it's interesting because I was thinking that, this obviously breaks so many of the, concepts that we've lived within for many years. So it can seem like magic, right? It's like, right. Wait, you could have this and you could have this. And obviously there are limits. It's not magic. It's technology that can seem magical. But it also, for us, it's like, oh, well, anything is possible. If we're breaking the rules, then we can break all the rules. And obviously there are constraints and there are limitations and there are performance issues, I'm sure, if you do things, the wrong way. One of the other things that occurred to me when you were talking about the eventual consistency, you're talking about it in milliseconds, but could that potentially also enable sort of like an offline synchronization mode where like you're entering into a disconnected instance or container, and then when you reconnect, it figures out how to become consistent with the rest of the system, which is obviously something we've wanted in FileMaker, especially as we've started developing FileMaker Go applications where you might be offline. Is it possible that this will enable that sort of sync without having to add another, sort of third-party layer on it? Could that make this potentially part of the tool set?
Well, yes. I mean, that sort of reconciliation is kind of baked into it. I mean, that was actually one of the things that, when you look more deeply into what these solutions do, it is magic, and it's one of those things that. But baked into it is that idea of reconciliation. When you come back in and bring the data back, or when you essentially commit your transaction, what happens, and making sure that everything works properly. One of the things that was mentioned also that I didn't talk about in the slides was this whole idea of no hard transactional boundaries. And that was one of those things to where when we're also, and I'll admit I'm that guy. I'm in that little sort of SQL box, like no, good fences make good neighbors kind of thing. And then we say, oh, no hard transactional boundaries. If you go one click deeper into that, what that really means is that you think about sort of the expense of committing a transaction. When you say commit that record, then it has to go and do all of its things, and then come back and say, did it succeed or did it not succeed? And that it takes time. I mean, it's especially on relational databases, it's computationally expensive. Whereas by not having a hard boundary on that, you can say, well, instead of committing one record, if you will, I'm going to commit 20 all at once. So that way sort of my start-stop costs of doing that commit and tracking it and doing the connection and everything else, I aggregate them all. So all of a sudden, boom, I commit 20 at a time, or 100 at a time, or however many it is, all at once, without having to say, oh, here's one, here's the next one. Where you have to. We've all done this, where it's like you're looping through to make these commits, and instead saying, you know what, take them all. You're all ready, go. And so that's a more. I think everything has its trade-offs, but I think that's an advantage of systems like this.
Great, thanks. Other comments, questions? Feel free to jump in. I think it's a small enough group that we don't necessarily.
Hey, Anton, Steve Abrahamson here in Chicago.
Hey, Steve.
I'm just trying to get my head around this and get a mental model of how this works and what's going on. You said there's no relationships, which my brain is still kind of broken on. And then you said you can then access relational data. Are you saying that what happens is there's no like stored relationship, but if you need to get to a child record or grandchild or great-great-grandchild, that it goes and does a query on that? Is there indexing? Can you talk a little bit about some of the mechanics of how it goes about that process?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll admit I'm not an expert on it, and Colleen put a great link there in the chat with that goes into more depth with regards to the data model. But essentially, essentially, excuse me. Essentially, you've got a couple things that are happening there. One, there is indexing, and one of the things that I glossed over is that in any instance of MongoDB, you've got all these separate indexing files that have that are also documents that have separate information in them. So that way, and that makes up for some of the otherwise latency issues you would have, and some of the summarization issues you would have. And so yes, there's indexing, and you can actually index on anything. You can index on any field, I believe. And so when you're ready to go, and as Jonathan and I were discussing a moment ago, some of that information is baked into the document, right? You can also have documents that are within the document. So you can have, because it's using an object model, very much like what you see in JSON, you can have sort of these embedded objects, these embedded documents, all the way down. This is a joke, it's turtles all the way down, right? But you can also then have obviously a reference and say, every document in MongoDB and most of these NoSQL databases, every document has to have an ID. And so you could, so you can think of that as your primary key, right? And so you could have that as a key value pair and say, okay, what's the ID for the document of that invoice? What's the ID, for that invoice line item? What's the ID for the product? And so you would then sort of do additional queries to pull that information up.
So you're saying that, whoa, are you saying that there's not actually dedicated key fields, but just key value pairs that might be?
Yes. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but yes.
Wow.
I mean, the only requirement.
That's time in my brain.
the only requirement for a document, at least, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, and I certainly might be, but the number one requirement, the only real requirement within a document in the Mongo database is that you got to have an ID. Everything else,
so
one
thing you might say is that the ID in the document is the primary key, and it's the only
right.
It's the only key. So there's no foreign key support, which, by the way, FileMaker doesn't have either. FileMaker doesn't really have primary key support either. So it's not really that, it's not that different. in terms of keys anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so you have to have that key. I mean, it's the only thing that you have to have.
Quick question, Beverly here. When you showed that first key value set, the keys were not quoted, and I don't need an answer right now, but later on you said it's JSON, which has the quoted keys. So something we need to kind of go back and research maybe. And
I was
say,
simplifying. That was in that very first example. I was doing it
Yeah.
to make it very clear what was a field and what was the data. That was just really me dropping the quotes. I was
okay,
abstracting.
thanks. No
Yeah,
problem.
one of the things that I generally do is when I'm usually introducing a topic, I leave off some of those details because I'm not expecting anyone to take a code snippet from that. It's really just to say, hey, you've got thing A, and then here's the value. And so I have the values only in quotes in that case.
One thing that I think worth saying, in case it's not clear if anyone's sort of getting anxious about all this, is we're not going to become MongoDB developers, right? FileMaker, I fully expect, and I don't have any more insight than what was been discussed, publicly in the Q&A and the keynote. But my expectation is that what FileMaker is going to do is use MongoDB under the hood, as it were, and then provide to FileMaker, the application, something that looks just like a table and fields and all of that we're used to in FileMaker. Just like ESS takes a SQL database of whatever sort and makes it look like a FileMaker table to us with fields. My hunch or guess is that just like you make a file reference to a ESS data source, that will have the ability to make a file reference to a Mongo data source. And when we do that, it will do the sort of translation for us to convert what's in the MongoDB backend look like what we're used to, tables and fields and records and all of that in FileMaker. That's what again, my intuition is that. So that's why when we say there's going to be they say there's going to be a migration path, we'll be able to take a FileMaker table and say, okay, now move that table to MongoDB, and they will handle all of the mechanics of making that look like still like a FileMaker table that we're used to us. Anton, is that your sort of interpretation as well?
I feel the same way. I mean, one of the reasons why I spent some time, going a little bit deeper on MongoDB, isn't that because I expect us all to be MongoDB, developers, but really more to talk about the structure and talk about that it's a different way of thinking, a different way of managing the information. More to help, to Steve's point, to kind of expand our minds a little bit. One of the jokes that I always make about computer science guys is that you have a coder getting ready to go to bed, and he brings 2 glasses of water with him. He brings one glass full of water in case he's thirsty, and he brings another glass of water with him that's empty in case he's not. And we often will have sort of these structured thinking, saying, I got to take into account every possibility, make sure there's always a field here. Well, what do we do if this field is not here? Well, and that's all good stuff, of course. But in some of these databases, some of these new structures, maybe the field isn't there. Or maybe you want to add some new data, and you're like, I've got to define your thing. I've got my old my old database professor going, make sure you define your variables up front. And you should. But database can handle it if you don't. You want to write to a field? Sure, it goes. Or you want to add a new data object? Sure, it just goes. And so all of us are kind of like, no, don't do that. But the idea that works, and it's something that can be functional, and there's actually an advantage to being able to do that. So where it's much more flexible, to where you don't have to build out all this infrastructure, on the database side, to accommodate changes and things like that. And so that was really my number one goal here, was simply to say, hey, these things exist, and they actually work. That they're legit ways of storing your data. Because all of it, I'm gray hair old SQL guy. So
great. Other questions or comments or?
Hey, I'll jump in. Anton, first off, really terrific presentation, cleared up a bunch of things for me, perhaps others. I dropped a question. I'll try and flesh it out. One of the big topics in the FileMaker community is transactions. And I think there's two sides to it. Transactions in the sense that things are going to be in sync, and also transactions in the sense that something succeeds or fails. And I think some of the classic examples are writing a document, let's say, just to use the Mongo lingo, writing an invoice document with associated line items, as you showed earlier, and perhaps at the same time writing a line item document with the associated invoice, perhaps two documents being written at the same time, both of which I'd imagine would have to succeed or fail at the same time. And I got to imagine that our friends at Claris have already thought this out and are going to maintain the ability to structure transactions in FileMaker. I just thought it was an interesting topic and a terrific presentation.
Thank you, Tony. And Joel, I see your comment there about record locking, and that's actually sort of where I began to run out of time. That was one of the things that is on my list of going in further is going more precise. You heard me talk very briefly about being sort of ACID compliant, and that's the thing that's going to help me get my heebie-jeebies down a little bit. And obviously it works, and people do it, and on the MongoDB website, they had a long white paper talking about that system and ACID and everything else, and I just hadn't had a chance to read it. So, but they said in a very short piece, they said, "Don't worry, we've got it." And so I have to think that some very smart people have already addressed it. But it's something that I'm just for my own intellectual curiosity, I'm planning on diving deeper into.
Cool, thanks.
Other comments, questions, thoughts about the implications for?
I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, I got into SQL back in the 80s, and my first Mac was back when all the applications, everything was on floppy disks, and when it was all about data normalization and all the different CODS laws. And it is mind-blowing to know that now that storage is so cheap, you can have document-based systems like Mongo, where all the data and the structure is internally, contained within a single document, a single document record. And and that being the case, I mean, it's of course extremely verbose, like XML, and so it takes a while to get your mind wrapped around these concepts of new concepts of data storage. I mean, one of the great advantage of FileMaker was it combined in one interface, data entry, data calculation, and data output in one neat package that you didn't really have to know much. You have majored in IT to understand. So now we're sort of, I guess I think in the latter part of my sunset or golden years in working with databases, that I understand the beauty of things like NoSQL, but I'm hoping that FileMaker will continue to wrap it all into one easy to use package. If not, then I'll probably be dead by then anyway. So anyway, Anton, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. I've certainly needed to have someone like you give me the ability to start wrapping my head around some of these concepts. Whether I end up having to use them or not, I don't know, but thanks again.
Thank you.
In terms of the acronyms, one of the things I heard was that actually NoSQL stood for not only SQL. So there was a more encompassing, as opposed to like a NoSQL, like oppositional view. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but
it's on the tip of my tongue, and I'm sure when I'm less caffeinated, I'll remember it. But there are a couple of different, sort of NoSQL databases that are actually also hybrids. So they have sort of like this NoSQL sort of document, if you will, but then has like chunks of SQL style data, sort of embedded in it. So you can kind of straddle both worlds. And yeah, one of the definitions of NoSQL is not only SQL, and so it can be a blend of both. And I think that, in my opinion, I think that what Claris is trying to do is also sort of have it not only be SQL, not have it where SQL is a euphemism for relational databases, to where they're trying to bridge, the best of both worlds. I mean, a lot of the things that we're struggling with now, is like, mobile deployment and, getting out to the cloud and having things distributed at scale. I mean, those are all things that we, as FileMaker developers struggle with. And it's like, well, and sometimes we say, oh, that's not going to be us, and we just don't even go there. And now with this new set of tools coming available to us, we can go there. We can take, the fantastic solutions that we have and scale them up.
I think another interesting thing when you really look at the arc of Claris as a company, back in the day when Bento was sort of released, it was this, hey, we've got this WYSIWYG tool for building applications that uses this invisible sort of industrial hidden database engine behind it, right? You didn't have to know how to go in and create your rows and columns, and Bento was sort of obscuring the complexity of it. But again, with Claris going, we don't need to build the back end. It's already there, right? That was a genius movement. Peter was one of the people around at that point in time. So for him to go away from Claris, come back, there's a little bit of turbulence in the FileMaker vision of where we're going to be with next version, up in the cloud first and all that. And I think coming a little bit back closer to, wow, we've already got this great tool that we already know how to use, and some of the shortcomings that Anton's pointed out have been raised, scalability and ACID compliant and things of that nature. So I think this is sort of almost like a Bento part due, kind of approach to, we've already got this great tool, we've already got ESS that we haven't exploited a lot, and Draco is the back-end engine that we've been hampered with for a lot of years in the modernization and scalability areas especially. So I think it's kind of an interesting, I'm just wondering if Peter is the guy that brought all this back, but he certainly was a part of the Bento spawning that happened years earlier. And this sort of smells very similar in some respects.
I'm pretty sure he was the engineering lead on Bento, actually. I think he was more than just on the team. I think he was one of the key players on that.
One last thing I want to bring up, MongoDB and a lot of these other things, they're all not all of them, but in particular, Mongo, it's open source. So, one of the challenges, we've all had our moments of complaining about Draco, going, oh, well, why can't it do this? And it really should rah, 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 rah. And with an open source solution, FileMaker doesn't have to carry all the water by itself, right? Claris doesn't have to carry all the water by itself. And so you can tap into, because there are people who are going to be extending Mongo for their own purposes, for their own thing. And to me, that's also part of the excitement, is that we get to leverage all those efforts and bring those back to allow for our solutions as well.
The other point to that, Anton, when you talk about open source, when FileMaker instances have to be spun up on the web, we're licensing Amazon servers, we're paying for Windows instances. Well, now we're not, we're using Linux and it's open source. So the cost of deploying, for Claris internally, the cost of deploying their tools and then having to put profit on top of that, at times, there are some things that they do that are not cost prohibitive at all because of the architecture they've had. So you're absolutely right. Number one, the engine can be improved, open source by the community, and Claris gets to benefit from that. But secondarily, FileMaker doesn't have to be saddled with a lot of high operating costs to be able to open this up to their customers. They don't have to charge as much, or there's not as small a profit margin for them available if they have open source tools that they're using.
Yeah, you're right. Steve, you had a question.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to make an observation, sort of going along the lines of my brain going, wait, what do you mean no structure? When FileMaker first was created, back when it was Nutshell, and when it first came to Mac, one of the big mind-blowing things about it was that you didn't have to know ahead of time what your schema was going to be, what your structure was going to be. You didn't have to know how long a field was going to be, how many characters it required. And this just blew everyone's mind because you could create a database like that. When FileMaker introduced variables, we didn't have to have the structure of declaring all of our variables at the very beginning of a session. We can just declare them willy-nilly, and then if we clear them, they're gone, and we don't need to worry about it. Both of these things totally landscape changing, and we never knew it because this is the world we've always known. So this idea of not having to set up, what fields we want, maybe this is actually right along the lines, and we just don't know it yet.
What's old is new sometimes.
Yep.
Colleen.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a little cautionary tale from the field. I was first introduced to this when my government client came to me and said, we're replacing FileMaker. And by the way, they told us they're going to use a NoSQL database. And they were frightened. They were, so I had to do my research and dig into it and actually assure them that this was going to be okay. So the only thing that I would say is, I know I tend to get really excited, and you're talking with client and just letting them know that the future is there and you can get out there. Make sure you've got it really well built in your head before you throw that out in front of a client, and let them know what those possibilities are.
Interesting. How did it go?
And yeah, how did it go?
They haven't migrated yet. That was 4 years ago now.
I've never heard that story before.
Exactly. But hopefully it will go well.
Great. All right, last call for questions or comments before we wrap up the session. Nope. All right, well, thank you, Anton. That was really, I think you've done us all a service. As we get further into it, maybe you'll come back and do a sequel, as no pun.
It would be my pleasure. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. All right, I'm going to pause recording now for a moment.
There's some of this will play into it. Yeah.
So Todd, take it away.
Take it away. Okay, yay. First of all, so great to see you all. I really want to do this in person. I'm tired of, when I go to FMDiSC, what I'm used to seeing is that front row, the back of Dave's head, the back of John's head, Jonathan's head. And now I'm all seeing the front of you. It's a little disconcerting. So I really hope we can do this in person sometime very soon. Thanks for having me here. And as I think I mentioned, this is my first real presentation in a while. So I'm going to go ahead and share. And I'm sharing on my other monitor. So I'm not used, it's going to be a little bit odd here. Yeah, see, now I can't see what I was hoping to see. That's unfortunate. Okay. I don't have the other, I didn't figure out how to get my other monitor. Oh, here it is up here. Got it. Yahoo. Okay. Great. So can everybody see my screen okay? If anybody can't, say no.
Yep, we got it.
We got it. Good. All right. So first of all, just some quick updates from me. Most of you probably heard, but maybe some haven't. So Geist Interactive and the Proof group merged, and I'm now the CTO of Proof plus Geist. And I'm here to talk about FM PubSub, which will play into some of the conversations we were just having a little bit. But so just some things that are happening on our side in what's been going on. So new company, got about 30 people now. It's a big change for me. We have new versions of Auto, which run on Linux, and a bunch of new features, some of which we're going to show just a piece of today, but they're not required for the demo and for the file that we're giving out. And we have a new hosting platform actually that is anchored on top of Auto. So we're not going to talk deeply about Auto, but many of you probably have seen me talk about it before. So that's coming out. And then this FM PubSub file is going to be coming out very soon as well. We're also going through this big rebranding, so things are a little confusing. Both sites are still up, plus there's a new site, and I'll talk a little bit about where to go buy our things and get these and use your coupon. There's a discount at the end, so you have to stay to the end to get the coupon. So rebranding FM Perception, FM Comparison, LedgerLink, and our hosting platform. We're also retiring these apps. So these have been around for, in some cases, a decade, and they just no longer make sense as applications. So these are going away so we can focus on new things. So this is like the Draco. This is the Draco. We are retiring these and moving on to other things, although they're not going to get rid of FileMaker, as they said. I want to mention auto enter. So this came up. This is the reason why I wanted to bring this up is auto enter is a Discord channel. And if you go to autoenter.live, you can get access to it. And this channel is pretty active during the keynote, events. That's what it's set up for, is for FileMaker's keynote and all of the Engage events. And so a lot of things happening, kind of like what we did last year for the actual, multi-day event. The reason I'm bringing it up is that a lot of the Claris execs are in this channel. And Peter Nelson, who we talked about before, the VP of engineering, spent, I think he spent like 6 days after that Q&A. He was just hanging out in our Discord channel, answering questions. So you can see him talking here. This is Peter talking, answering questions of just regular old developers, anybody who wanted to come in and ask him a question. He spent hours on this channel talking about this stuff. So I encourage you to check it out, especially when the next events come up, and just see who drops in and can share stuff like this. They can't do this on their own. They can't do this on their own community stuff because Apple is Apple, but they can join other groups that are run by other third parties, and they can talk there. And so that's what they're doing. This is a freely available thing for anybody to come and just as long as they're there, as long as you're nice, because we will kick people out for being jerks. We like that Claris is in there telling us things, and we like to keep them there. So be nice and be respectful, but certainly use that as a place to explore. Has anybody, was anybody here at the last Discord, at the last event? And were they on this channel? I think some of you were. I know Vince was, and
Yeah,
a few
I
others.
was.
Yeah.
It was great. Thank you for setting that up, Todd.
It's really unprecedented that we get, the VP of engineering and Brad's in here and a bunch of other people in here actually participating. So treat it like a real gift, because it
was really interesting to watch them talking and looking at their monitor and knowing that we said something on auto enter.
That's right.
And they would kind of chuckle a little bit and and they even talked about that. Hey, I see you, you seeing me. That's
right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's cool. Anyway, encourage you to check that out. Okay. So back to where we're at here. So PubSub. So first of all, some of this is going to be like, well, yeah, we already do things like this. So yes, you're probably doing things that are like PubSub already. And so what PubSub is kind of a standardized way of talking about these kinds of things, and also setting it up, architecting it, testing for it, making it robust, et cetera. But so here are some PubSub-ish things in FileMaker. So when you perform a script on server to avoid long waits for the user, so you're getting some long task off of the user's thread and just say, hey, server, go do this, right? So one way you can think about that is you're publishing an event to the server and saying, server, run that script. And the server is listening and says, okay, I'm going to run it, and does it, right? So that's publish and subscribing. The server's listening for particular publish events and it's doing things for you. Server-side script schedule, same thing. Catching inbound webhooks. So when some other service is sending you stuff and you need to catch it and deal with it. These are all things that are kind of like PubSub. Claris Connect kind of plays in this place also, where it's sending you events, create a new record, right? And your server saying, okay, I'm going to create a new record, right? So those are all PubSub-ish things. So it's really a lot about background processing. If you think about what's very different today compared to many years ago when a lot of us started doing this. And by the way, it's great to see Steve here. I don't think I've seen Steve in forever, but back in the day when we were starting this stuff, most of the scripts and things got triggered by people actually pressing buttons. So logic was driven by people doing things on a screen. More and more, that's not the case. There's events coming in, emails are getting received, webhooks are coming in, script schedules are kicking off and doing things without a user interfacing with it at all, right? So how do you manage that? How do you even think about what it is to adjust to that kind of a system, which is what we have now, or sort of how do you adjust to that kind of world, which is what we have now with the internet throwing you things and you having to throw things back at the internet. So PubSub is asynchronous communication between different applications or different parts of the same application. So that's one way to describe it. Here's another way to think about it. So you have publishers which publish a message to a channel on something called a message queue. And so these publishers can be Lambda functions, they can be webhooks coming in, they could be scripts or functions that are simply saying, hey, message queue, here's a message on a topic like customer updated, and here's the customer data, right? So a message is typically two things, a payload and a channel. The payload is usually JSON, and the channel is some description of what it is that I'm throwing on the queue. Subscribers talk to the queue and they say, hey, queue, when customers are updated, let me know, send me the payload. And those subscribers can be anything that's capable of doing that. So application modules, applications, again, scripts and functions that might just be, that's their only job is to just listen for things coming in on this queue. So the thing here, the interesting part of this architecture is that the two sides do not need to know anything about each other. So the things that are publishing do not need to know what's listening. And the things that are listening don't need to know what's publishing, who's publishing. They're just interested in sending payloads and receiving payloads, right? So that makes this line between there and a contract of decoupling, where these applications can be completely separate, but able to share data back and forth through this process. So loosely coupled. So each sides of this equation don't have to know anything about the other. And so they can be isolated and modular, and they can evolve on their own pace. They don't have to be stuck together. You know, the publisher does not have to be updated when the subscriber does, because they're sharing that contract in the middle, which they both need to handle. And as long as they do that, the publishing thing can go through many iterations. It's fine. The listening thing can go through many iterations. It's fine. And then users don't get stuck waiting for long running processes. So this is easy to adopt because you don't have to worry about, again, sort of where each side of this equation is. It's very easy for one side to subscribe to a topic and just start getting events, start getting these message payloads passed to it. And also it's an easy to understand metaphor or architecture. You have publishing and you have subscribing, and that's pretty much it. So why do we not want to do this in FileMaker? So we've mentioned webhooks and syncing, sending updates back and forth. Decoupling large FileMaker apps is another big part of this. So if you have a large app with a massive graph, you know what the problem is if you want to add something new to that, is that new thing is going to have to inherit all of the bloat of the old thing. Well, if you have a way to exchange data back and forth, you might be able to break out a part of that app or build something new and just have it exchange data back and forth when it needs to, right? So PubSub and FileMaker. So how we've envisioned this, and this is what FM PubSub does, is so publishers are FileMaker scripts. So when a script is, when it wants to send a message to the queue, it calls another script, and we'll look at this in detail when we get to the demo. That's just basically says publish a message, and it will publish the message on the channel, and other scripts or other files or other applications can say, hey, I'd like to listen to that event, to that message, if anything happens on that channel, and send me the payload. And so that's it. We're talking about a FileMaker script that can call another script that says publish. And we're talking about the subscriber just being a script that gets called whenever that message gets pushed onto the queue. So that is the basics of like the key concept to understand. That's how it works. So it's not really very it's not very complex. You could probably all imagine lots of ways to get this to work. And so this is just one implementation of how this sort of thing could work. Let me stop there and just ask if there's anybody who's needs something clarified before we go on. We good?
Hey, Todd,
Yes.
just very, very top view. Is this a product, a service?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think that's coming up on the slide coming up here. I know I'm going to cover it at some point, but let me go ahead and say this. So I think I've got it written down. Let's see. So FM PubSub is a FileMaker file, and it is something you add to a server, and it becomes this message queue that you can send messages to and from, and then listen to. So it's just a file you drop on your server. You give it the proper bit permissions to talk to other files, and that's it. But you're not sharing any graph. So the file itself has no graph shared with your other applications. Does that help?
Absolutely. Thank you.
So the flow of how this comes together. So a message has a channel and a payload. The payload is JSON. So it's really two fields. You get a payload, which says, which is what the data is, and the channel is really describes sort of, I'm sorry, the payload is the data, and the channel is sort of what the data is about. It's the customer updated, invoice created, tweet received, email received, that kind of thing. A channel has subscribers, so you can subscribe a script to a specific channel. And just in this case, let's say we have customer updated has 4 subscribers. So 4 different FileMaker scripts that could each live in their own file that are listening for updates on that channel. So when that happens, 4 new records are made for each, for that message, 1 for each of the subscribers. And then a server-side script finds those new records and calls the scripts in each of the target file, passing it the original data. And the schema is pretty simple. It's literally this. You got channels, subscribers. The subscriptions is the join between channels and subscribers. And messages have a channel, and they each message will generate as many message queue records as it has for subscribers. And that's really it. I'm gonna, yeah, so this, I should have put this up further in the stack. But this is what it is. So this is free and unlocked. We're not charging for this app. We're just giving it away. I'm going to demo it with Auto, which is our server side, it's our FileMaker server superpowers thing. It has lots of stuff in it, including a really nice way to receive webhooks, which isn't really a part of this demo in particular, but I'm going to use it anyway. Okay.
Quick question, Todd.
Yes.
So are those message queue records preserved? And does it effectively act sort of like a journal?
Yep, it does.
So you could, if you added a subscriber later,
you could get it to
effectively go back and rerun those through the queue and provide it with whatever it hadn't received.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. So I'm dumping a lot of data on you, tried to give a lot of different ways to look at it. And then we'll spend the rest of the session looking at the file itself. So some of this stuff will be quite obvious once you see it. But just to kind of lay the groundwork for the demo that we're going to try to do is, so we're going to have Typeform, which is a web service that you can put, basically create forms for, very nice forms, people filling out those forms. And then that is going to call a webhook, which will be received by FM PubSub. And again, we use Auto to mediate that reception, but you wouldn't have to do that. You could use Claris Connect to do that if you wanted to. Or you could just call Data API directly if you wanted to. FM PubSub will then, it will receive that message, and it will send it'll call a script in the demo contacts file to update the contacts, because that's what the web form is. It's a form of contact details. And it will, so that will get updated, and that demo contacts will then publish a message back to PubSub saying, I updated the data. And then another file is going to be listening for that. And it's going to send a Slack message to a Slack channel saying that so-and-so updated the file. Now, this is a little bit contrived, but we needed something simple because in the reality, you know, so what typically happens to this, and this is why we're doing this, is we built this kind of thing several times. And so we've abstracted what we think is the best pattern and put it in here. You end up with, you know, dozens of subscribers and dozens of channels that are getting data fed into them. And so you want a way to consistently handle this pattern of outside apps talking to FileMaker talking to a bunch of different parts of FileMaker, and then FileMaker maybe talking to an outside app. That's really the fundamental thing that we're doing here with PubSub. And that's what we're kind of going to show here. Make sense? Any questions before we jump in there? All right, groovy. I like getting slides out of the way. I much prefer code to slides. Let me get this out of the way. Why is this not moving? Well, I will just close it then. How's that? All right, so let's move this. So here is FM PubSub. And you land on this page. We've got some subscribers set up. So these are, I'll go into what this format is in a minute. These are things that are listening. And so these are FileMaker scripts. We've got channels. So these are the channels that messages are getting published to. We've got the queue, which is things that have been either processed or waiting to be processed. And then we can also look at the message themselves if we want. So looking at the relationships here, there's a lot of like UI and scripting stuff here, but this is really all we're talking about for the structure. I don't even activity log. This doesn't need to be here. I'm just going to remove it. I don't know why it's still there, or this one. We're pulling a bunch of things together, so it's a little we still got a lot of copy pasta errors around here, but this is really it. Message, subscribers. There's really the only elements that we're dealing with here. There's not a lot happening. It's pretty simple. Messages, subscribers, the message queue, and the things, and that's really it. It's just not a lot. The way we do things is in a proof plus Geist is we always have these APIs set up for being able to interface with our solution. So here are the scripts that you would need to use to publish a message, for example. So here's publish message. And so publish message takes a channel and a payload. And it's going to use perform script on server to just put that on the queue and return immediately. So when you write a script that you want to publish a message with, all you're getting back is it worked. Like, we're good. It doesn't actually wait for all the listeners. It just says, we got the message. Your message is going to be handled by the queue. You can go about your business. And these are things for like automatically registering subscribers, subscribing to a channel. So you could have things programmatically connect to this PubSub queue, or disconnect or disable and turn things on and off with this API. But this is really going to be the main one, is this publish message. This is the one you're going to call whenever you want to send something to the queue. And so let's run this little demo here, and then we can get into some questions. So what I'm going to do is Typeform. So I'm going to use Typeform here to demo the publish message, just to make the point. it's eventually going to call that script that we just looked at. But I wanted to make the point that you could do this from any application, including a web app, anything that can do webhooks, anything that can contact, that can send an HTTP request. You can use FM pub sub with. And so that's really what this is about. But it could be another FileMaker database. And in fact, we'll see that in a little bit. Oh, we're going to use that picture in a little bit. All right. So I'm going to enter my real first name, Robert II, and my last name. Oh, actually, let me pause there for a second, talk about where this data is going to end up, because this is actually important. Did I close my demo file? No, here it is. So I want to make the point that we don't get to build from scratch. It's very rare. Like people have got applications they're already running, or they've got, or they've even stuff that we built for them years ago. We rarely get to build from scratch. So we end up with files that might have started from templates or whatever that we have to build on top of. So I'm using the contacts thing from FileMaker's templates to make that point. So it's a pretty, it's just whatever we get. So this is the database that we have to integrate with. And we didn't get to make a lot of choices about it. It's just there, but we can already start to use this pub sub thing with it, because we're going to turn this demo file into a listener. And let's take that nice, cute picture of my dog. And now let's see here. So what we want to do is get the queue up so you can see it. When I do the done. So there, a new message was just put on the queue. Typeform, test typeform contact new. Its status is new. So it hasn't been processed yet, but it's been delivered, and you can see the data here. So FileMaker now has that data. Every minute, a server-side script is going to look for new things, and it's going to process that. And so this will run in a minute. But you can already, so you can see just as this is going, you can see we have this retry button here. So if for some reason your message doesn't work, you've got an error, your script is wrong, something didn't work the way that it was supposed to and returns an error, you've got the data right here, and you can retry. You can resend the data on through the pipeline just by clicking the retry button. And oh, okay, it ran. So that one was delivered. And what happened is this database was updated. Robert 2 is the name. And it published another message to test contact updated. Now it's waiting for it to go out. And it will go out, and it should hit this Slack channel here in a minute or so. So while we're waiting for this to go through, anybody have any questions so far? And we're going to look at each of these pieces, but I wanted you to see the flow happening before we dove in a little deeper.
Hey, Todd.
There it goes.
When you get to the showing the I'm sorry, the scheduling area, could you zoom in on the what looks like JSON there, just to show us what's there?
Yep, I will. I just want to point out that message that was published was also been delivered, and there's this Slack message down here that Robert 2 updated their contact info. So we had We had Typeform talk to FileMaker. FileMaker updated a contact record in one database. And then it sent a message to another database that was responsible for sending Slack messages. And that database sent the Slack message. So all of those things are managed by something like this queue. All right, so that's how the flow can work. Let's take a look at these individual pieces.
Todd, I had a question.
Sure,
Your data is JSON.
that's right, always.
As a downstream consumer of data in various fashions, whether it's ODBC or webhooks or whatever, the difficulty I've always had is the upstream provider changing format, changing field names, providing wonky data. So how does this address that?
So the first part is, so a company that's sending you a webhook that changes their data is not doing a very good job. They should let you know that there's a new version coming, but that's part of why there's this retry thing. So this is the nature of the world we live in. I know it feels really, it's a little disconcerting to go from a time when we literally controlled the universe to a time when we've controlled very, very little, right? This data is coming at us from everywhere. Apps have data we need. They want to talk to us and we need to talk back. And some part of that means that sometimes the messages that we think we're receiving are going to change. And we have to have a system to be able to deal with that, because that is what happens. So if you, that's why, like in Claris Connect, you can go in and replay parts of those things, right? And so that's what this is. It's if your data is changing and it's now different, it's going to have an error, right? It's not going to be processing right. So you can go and find that in your system and you can retry it until that script is now working again. And then it will just continue to work. So that's actually a really important part of this, is how to handle errors, because errors will happen because you cannot control all the pieces. You also might not be able to control, what if this demo file is down? What if one of these files is not up on the server? What are you going to do? How are you going to handle that?
So Todd, would you say that one of the key benefits of this is this persistent message queue?
Well, that's the point. That's what PubSub is. Right?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of like, what the take home, we don't remember anything else.
So PubSub is a model for accepting messages and telling people things that are interested in it, in those changes, that it got a message and here it is. And so it has to be able to handle things like errors, like your script is wrong, or how about record locking? It needs to be able to handle a record locking error. It needs to be able to handle that the file isn't up, it's closed because maybe it's doing data migration at the moment. So you don't get to control when a webhook's coming in, it's just going to come in. So you have to be able to handle that in some way. And so that's a big part of what PubSub as, and by the way, we didn't invent this. In fact, if you look at the about page, it links to the Wikipedia article about PubSub. This is a very standard mechanism for doing this kind of thing. Most large enterprises use what's called event-oriented architectures, where events are happening in the system and they're just being sent off to different message queues. And then the message queues are receiving those events and other things are listening to the events and then processing them. That's kind of how most of the internet runs. Really, that's how the internet runs, frankly. And so this is just an implementation of that pattern within FileMaker.
And Todd, if the message queue were unavailable to receive the message, you'd rely on the external source to resend it?
That's right. And so most webhook publishers do that. They should. So a publisher should do something where they retry, because basically they're going to say, they're going to send you a message and your code needs to respond with a 200, HTTP status code 200. And then I got the message. And if it doesn't respond with a 200, it's going to assume that you didn't get it. And it's going to try again. Each of those publishers, each of those webhook publishers is going to have a different strategy for how often and what frequency they try until they give up, but they usually will give up. They do things like exponential back off. So it'll try in 5 minutes. And then if it doesn't work in 5 minutes, it'll try in 10 minutes and then an hour and then 4 hours and then a day, and then it will give up, kind of thing. But that's kind of it. So one of the parts that Auto helps with is just handling that inbound webhook, because we're taking the translation from a webhook, which is HTTP JSON, and we're just giving it to you as a script, basically saying, here's the data, go deal with it. And so we don't have to, but we don't have to have a separate service running, and we don't have to deal with calling directly to the data API, which can be a problem. Auto can, and I'm happy to go into how Auto helps with that if you're interested, but it's not really the meat of this demo. But it does help us with making sure that we get webhooks responded to. Now, if it's your internal FileMaker system that is down, well, then your internal FileMaker communications aren't going to be running anyway, right? So that's not really the issue. What the reason you want FM PubSub to be its own file is that this is a file you don't want to come down. So this is a file you're not doing data migrations on. You're not taking it down. It's just sitting there, and it's catching whatever external events are coming in. And when the rest of the system is available, it is going to automatically start processing those messages. So any messages that get an error, any messages that don't have in this message queue here, any messages that don't have that are 0 or are set to be able to be retried. So they'll just start running. So if they haven't been delivered, or if they're flagged as we tried, failed, but it's okay to try again, it'll just start, as soon as the thing's available, it'll start running again.
Anton, I would just like to get an understanding on how closed down it is, because I'm guessing the rest
It's
of the
completely
system,
unlocked. You can do anything you want to it.
No, I didn't mean the file. I meant to the rest of the system, because there could be sensitive data in what gets logged in there. And so the other files, basically all they get to do is they get to run script in there, or call script. And then PubSub turns around and says, okay, who are my subscribers? And then does like perform script by name or something like that.
That's right. Exactly right.
But the other files do not have any like read access to what's in there. Okay.
That's right. The only way these files are connected is to PubSub via script calls only, no data.
Awesome.
Right. And so that's actually a great point as far as security goes, because now 2 good points to make there. One is PubSub is going to have tons of data in it that you're not going to want probably available to everybody, because any data coming in that might be sensitive, email addresses, whatever it could be, is going to be in PubSub. So you're going to want to have, you're going to want to destroy this data at certain, once the message is delivered, you don't really need it, at least not for long. You can get rid of it. You're going to want to get rid of the data after some period of time. And you wouldn't want to make PubSub available to anybody to come in and poke around at. The good news is that let's use contact information as the main point, just to keep the same topic, is you can have one file that is available only to certain users and has a lot of sensitive contact information, maybe patient data or employee data or whatever. And you have another file that just really needs to know first name, last name, and like the user ID. So it can use it to like make relationships or valueless, right? This is pretty common, where we need to have another application just be able to know a little bit of data from the first application, but not all the data. So this gives you a way to do that, because the main system that has all the sensitive information, it can just publish the bits that aren't sensitive to the PubSub, and apps that want that data can get it, and they'll just listen for it and they'll get it. So they don't have to they can have completely different users. They can have completely different security privilege settings. They're completely unrelated, except for this script call only, which you can lock down very tightly, because most of it actually is all done with server-side scripting. So it's not even UI. So you can really make these so they don't even work if it's a FileMaker Pro client. Like it could only be the network like the server-side scripting client that's doing the work. So it can be very, very secure. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. Thank you.
Questions?
Hey, just a comment, kind of riffing off what Robert and you were talking about. Just brainstorming here. It's kind of brand new to me, some of this. I wonder if you could throw in some encrypt, decrypt, full access, and prohibit modification. You know, those 4 features, kind of put them together in a comprehensive way to get a robust security for
Well, I
encrypted
think,
data.
yeah, I mean, you're still gonna have to put those keys somewhere. So that's the thing, right? I mean, somewhere the keys have to exist. Now, you could certainly, like, here's the data right here. This is the payload that comes in, plain text JSON. There's no reason why you couldn't store that encrypted. And then when the subscriber is called, it could unencrypt it before it gives it to the subscriber.
Yeah,
Totally doable.
that's I'm thinking
Yeah.
the same thing. And
Totally doable. But that is still, the key has to be somewhere. So it's really the security of the key that matters then.
yeah, I would agree, you know, and
Yeah.
that I think there was in Chicago, they were talking about, you know, you don't want something showing up in the DDR, for example, or yeah, you got to
deal with it. You got to deal with that in some way.
Absolutely.
But I think security privileges would also give you everything you need here. Like this file and the other files. So the other files have to share a privilege set, obviously, that they can communicate to, but that privilege set can be very tight. Like it can not show any layouts. It could have execution only on scripts. Like it could be very, very tight so that anybody snooping around in this file just wouldn't be able to, there'd be nothing there unless they had that server level password, right? That service account level password, which would essentially be the same as if they had the encryption key. But I think it's probably worth thinking about adding that as a potential thing. Like maybe each channel, you could have channels that are encrypted and decrypted. Like, so we could do something like in this channel database where we add a channel, you could have like encrypt as an option and maybe even, encrypt with a key. And that way the key isn't in the DDR, it's in the database, which is probably better. And then this channel, every packet that got dropped in for this channel would be encrypted. I like it.
Yeah, and I don't want to say, you know, the rule is don't say too much about security on a recorded conversation.
That's right.
But, you know, that all said, there's some very, hi, Steve, wherever you are. There's some very interesting possibilities, I think, between the prohibit modification, full access, encrypt and decrypt. But like you said, I think it's worth thinking about. The other thing I just want to shout out to the concept of using a queue for inventory management.
Yeah.
We have one of the challenges we've seen over the years is how to, you know, statically update inventory when it's often in the table that people interact with and you hit record locking. So running that through a queue, you know, does, as you said it earlier, protect you against record locking. So I'm going to enjoy the rest of the presentation. Thanks a lot.
It solves record locking. It solves stopping, you know, not forcing the user to wait for something to happen.
Yeah, get it off their desktop.
Get it off their desktop. You know that you want it to happen eventually. So just get it off and put it into the background. And let the background be responsible for making sure that it happens, right?
Sending emails is huge. PDFs.
Yep. PDFs, generating PDFs. Let the background do it. And this also lets you develop like utility files that handle things like creating PDFs or you know, have specialized functions like calling Slack channels. And those can live in another file. They can be managed and maintained and developed in a completely different type of setting. Not that different type of setting, but they can have their own cadence of when you ship new features, and they don't impact the rest of your app. Like, so we have this, so that sending Slack message sits over here. It's this one, update Slack channel, right? So that's a subscriber. You could think of having a whole file full of nothing but things that you think you might want to, that, you know, sending emails, sending Slack messages, sending Twilio messages, you know, all kinds of stuff that are very utilitarian. Like, just make a file for that and then use the queue to schedule things to run in that file, kind of stuff. So the way this, like, here's update Slack channel. So what does that subscription look like? So if you look at the subscriber, FM pub sub subtest, that's just the name of the file, : update Slack channel. That's how you can use perform script by name with a script in another file if you didn't know. So that's just FileMaker. There's not, I mean, we're doing a lot of error trapping and we're doing a lot of things to be very safe about making sure that messages get delivered or not. But this is pure, other than that, it's very straight up FileMaker. We're just calling the script by name. And we can tell if the file isn't up, we're going to get an error. And it'll be an error that the system knows it can retry on later. So if we get an error of 100, we can try it later. If we get an error of 104, the script is missing, we don't try. We permanently fail. You know, that's going to send a message to the person responsible for the system. So you've got a permanent error you're going to need to fix because somebody changed the name of the script or something like that, right? So there's a lot of that going on under the hood, but it's all here and you can go through it and look at it. I don't think we have enough time to dive in too deep into those scripts, but the core concept is pretty simple. I dump a payload. All right, so here's what the messages look like. I dump a bunch of data in. It sends out, it creates a record for each subscriber that it wants to do. And that's what ends up in the queue. A server-side script is looping through this every minute and calling a script by name with that payload. That's it. It's really not, the concept is not more complicated than that. The implementation is a little challenging, but it's not even that hard, frankly. We just wanted to pull together because we built this system over the last several years, probably 24 different ways. And we just wanted to have one way that we could just use and just be like, this is our standard way of responding to events in the FileMaker system. This is it. Boom, done. And so this file is pretty close to ready. It'll be ready in the next, probably next week. We may wait a little longer, but it's very soon. That will be, the only reason I'm saying is that most of the team is about a third of our team is at pause. And so I don't get to make all the decisions anymore. So Ernest gets to decide when we release things like auto and these files. And I can't confirm with him exactly what the day it is until he gets back, but very soon we're going to have new things. So we've got a whole new documentation page for auto that you can start poking around. This is sort of nobody's seen this yet. So you guys are seeing it for the first time. This is not done yet. You'll see stuff that's still in content in place, but the docs are here. So we're trying to do some kind of a launch. I don't know exactly when all the pieces are going to fall together for this, but this is going to be part of our launch that we're going to do with the new websites and new site designs and all that kind of thing.
I have a question, Todd.
Yes.
Since all of this is working on the server, it works okay. You can set up FileMaker mobile.
Yeah, exactly. This is a great way, again, to get things off of, in fact, you could do a light syncing or at least posting. Like you could have an offline FileMaker Go app that publishes messages. It's a great use case. Thanks for bringing this up. But you could have a lightweight, you could have an offline FileMaker Go app that simply connects to your server, publishes a message, and then disconnects. Says like you're doing like data collection in the field, which is a very common use case. This would be a great way to do that. The message was received. I don't care about opening that entire backend giant system, which on mobile is really slow, right? So you just open up PubSub, which doesn't have any graph dependencies, so it opens instantly. Call the thing, close it, and let the server take over.
Very cool.
Great use case for that.
Yeah, that fills a huge need there.
Yep. And in fact, if you want to use the data API to publish that message, you don't even have to publish open FM PubSub. You can just make a data API request from your offline Go app, and that'll be super fast, instant. Like the users won't even, they'll just hit save and be done. There'll be no delay at all. That message will be safely dumped into the server queue and the server queue will process it. Great one.
Sorry, just a quick follow up on that, because I use data API. So you're saying you do a data API to the pub sub from your mobile app?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, that would be really quick.
Yeah.
Nice.
Eventually you just need to call this publish message. However you call that script, you can do it. So we have this auto receiver script in here. So we have, let me just quickly show this. A couple things. So the new version of Auto also, if you use Auto's webhook receiving thing, the new version of Auto has a log of all the inbound requests coming in. So by the way, this is our log viewer so this uses FileMaker's logs and also the auto receiver log. And yeah, it's currently not working because this, I may need to log in again. Yeah, I do. So it's not quite ready for release, as you can see. But where's my finger's usually up there to press. So yeah, so here's so you get FileMaker's logs. This is a nicer UI than theirs, and you can search. And then you've also got the auto logs, including webhooks. So you can see webhooks that are coming in. This is really great for debugging. And you can do this. You can do a nice search here for different things. But one of the things I wanted to show was in the API receiving webhooks. So we make it really easy to receive webhooks with auto. You can see this part of the screen right here. Here it is. So most webhooks are a post request. They're a post request to a URL. So if you construct a URL that includes your database, in this case, FM PubSub, but it could be any database, and a channel, which is what am I sending? Customer updated, invoice received, email received, whatever. And then there's an API key that says I'm allowed to use this publisher. Then that will publish. If you use the FM PubSub one, that'll publish right to this queue. That's it. So you can put this webhook in any system that can send webhooks and change the channel name, and it'll just start publishing to your PubSub. That's what it will do. But you can use the data API and come up with your own way of doing that as well. No reason you don't have to do that. This eventually uses the data API. It just makes it so you don't have to even think about it. You just have to construct a URL correctly to post that webhook, and that's it. What else? Am I out of time? I don't even know what the clock says.
Hey,
You're
Todd, what's
fine.
the minimum version for running this minimum version?
I think we put 19 on there. Do we have any 19 dependencies? Probably not. So we might put it back on 18. But we won't make any attempt below that for sure. In fact, even 18 is end of life at this point. But one of the things we are saying is we would like to be able to use this to do integrations with older systems, and those systems might be stuck. I think, so let me rephrase that a little bit. I think you're going to need to, you got to at least be able to do perform script by name and JSON. Those will probably be the hard limits.
I'll just
So
opine that the lowest version that you can get away, 18 better than 19 if it has no dependencies based on market share concept,
Well,
18, 19,
Yeah, 18 and 19 are, of course, it's a weird place because FileMaker said 18 is no longer supported. So, but typically we have a lot of clients still on 18. So it's just like this limbo that is
I would just
rather
say
annoying.
if anyone from FileMaker Claris is listening, market share matters.
It does matter. We'll just have to see. I mean, they're pushing really hard to get people on new versions. I don't know what that's gonna they may have stopped security updates on 18. Stephen, I know we have two Stevens. We have Abrahamson and Blackwell on here, might know. But at some point they will stop doing security updates. And at that point, you're probably not wise to be on 18. Although I get why people are. That's just the reality of it as well. But I think we will probably try to get as far back as we can because we see this as a tool to help people come forward. So you've got this old thing that you need to keep doing, but you want to start a new thing. So here's a way to keep them.
And be happy with the platform.
Yeah.
You know, it's just anyone who's on 18 hasn't gone to 19 is just a future upgrade. It's just money in the bank.
Yeah.
There's a use case for using this as glue between disparate version systems.
Yeah. I mean, you could, and I see that. I think part of the challenge is as a FBA member, part of your agreement, if you go and look in there, is that you need to push very hard to support only the supported things of FileMaker. And so we're not even supposed to like say that we support other versions. Obviously we kind of have to, but it's just, they're pushing really hard on it. So I am being as sort of ambiguous as I can be, maybe is one way to put it. Or as I don't know, I'm being ambiguous, but for a reason, maybe that's the way to say it.
Cool.
In terms of the subscribers, Todd, is it possible for a subscriber to be on a different server altogether, or do they need to sit side by side on the same server?
So FileMaker can use, so the key is going to be this, the data source name. So we're just using data sources, right? Nothing fancy here. These are just data sources. So can it be on another server? Yes. In practice, running, so you're going to be opening on a FileMaker server. The server-side script process is going to try to open a file on a different server. That should work. I think it sort of is guaranteed to work. What I don't know is how well the performance will be on that. It's going to be, you're now opening it over the internet, whereas if it's on the same server, it's instant. That's one of the nice benefits here, is that you're not actually requiring the clients that are doing all the processing have immediate access to the databases. I think it'll work, but I think it will be slower to call those scripts. But yeah, I mean, so what PubSub is really about, it's about allowing you to integrate between different systems. So this could work. Now, the way we would probably do that is we would probably have, instead of a FileMaker file opening a file on another server and calling PubSub, the publish message, we would probably call a data API on the other server to publish the message so that we don't have to open the file. But you can certainly do, right? Your subscriber script can call HTTP, right? So it could call the data API on the other server, and that, you know, again, it's the same thing. It's just, so you could have multiple copies of FM PubSub on different servers communicating to each other. Not a problem. Not a problem at all.
I thought I saw a system where it was an issue, like calling a script from a file on a different server from something that was server side. I'd have to.
There
go
are
back and
issues.
check,
There are
but,
issues when things are in different folders. Server-side scripts care about the folder structure in your server. So the data, so the file references have to be they have to actually they have to include folders. So that's true, and that will be true here as well. Your server-side reference, this file reference has to work on the server, right? The one we're just looking at. So this file reference has to work on the server. But I don't know, and I think so the better answer is to make an HTTP request to the data API.
Yeah.
And also remember, the inbound on the data API is free, so there's no cost to do that. So that's the way to do it. It'll be faster, and then you're treating, then that system has, then you don't even have to have an external file reference in here, right? You just have your script makes an HTTP request, and then that's just like, it's like publishing a webhook. That's all it's doing. It's sending a webhook to another version of FM PubSub.
Thanks.
Any other questions, comments? Todd, anything you want to share just in general, your thoughts about where things are going?
Well, yeah, so both in terms of the main reason we came up with this, I mean, there's two reasons. One, the integration, things flying around from different systems. We got to deal with that. We got sick of building the same sort of, okay, accept a webhook, make sure I got it, make sure I have the data, and then I can process it in a separate step so I don't have error, all that dance. But the other one is that we're increasingly running across large solutions. Companies come to us with old, big solutions, and they're really slow. And we don't even want to work in those solutions because you can't, I mean, there's just so many roadblocks you hit when it doesn't open over the internet, for whatever reason, or it takes too long. So the other reason was to be able to take an old system and build new stuff that can still use data in the old system without the relationship graph dependency. That's the key thing here. There's no relationship graph dependency between the files that you're building here. So this is, these are disconnected. And we think this plays rather nicely into what's coming down the road because, they're going to allow us to move our data from our old systems, from our, move the data into this new MongoDB backend. And I'm sure they'll be able to do something and it will do pretty well. But my guess is not all systems will want to move that way. I'm just, sort of thinking about data migrations can be challenging. But what if you had a situation where you have a solution you build completely new and then brand new, whatever Claris calls this new Mongo thing. But you want to be able to exchange data lightly with your old FileMaker system. You want something like this to do it, right? You can make this work easily for that. Right. And so this is again a way to sort of say, hey man, you can build new, use new techniques, right? FileMaker 19 for this file, FileMaker, whatever it is, whatever this new thing is for this new business process, and not have to like upgrade or, just go have to deal with this backend, which can continue to be what it is and serve the purpose that it's serving without breaking it or trying to migrate it. So we feel like this is a good piece to have, is the ability to do that.
Right, makes sense.
So I think I said a lot already about the direction, and I think it's pretty clear that I'm enthusiastic about what they're doing. And I think, the key takeaways for me are they've decided that FileMaker, the Draco engine, can't move fast enough, and they've decided to move on to something else, which I think is a tough decision, but one that they could make. And they did. And I think the main reason it got made now is that there's literally nobody left from the old days at the top level here. It's all new people, and nobody's really, none of the VEEPs or above really have anything to lose about. They have no, they don't have to be defensive about their old technology. They can just say, it is what it is. It's good. We're going to continue to support it. And it works great for a lot of people, and we'll add what we can to it. But the real future is going to be in this new thing where we're going to be able to do stuff that's really cool.
Right. And they seem to have a pretty well thought through bridge between them.
That's right.
Not
And they
just
do.
like,
right.
That's the old thing we'll keep it alive or whatever. And this is the new thing. Everybody move to the new thing. It seems like they're going to provide a way of having a foot in both worlds, which, I think is ideal.
I think so too. And I'm really happy with, I think they'll probably try to fill the position again, but there's no current VP of marketing or product. I think they called it VP of product. Sorry, there's marketing. That's Britta, but there's no VP of product. So that was Srini. And he's no longer there. And it's being really Peter and Brad are the ones that are really sort of calling the shots on the product with input from everybody else. But I think that's a good move for a technology company. I'm not the person making the key calls on the product really needs to have a deep technical understanding. They don't have to be like an engineer necessarily. And Peter's not going to write any code. I mean, he hasn't written code probably in a long time, but he needs to have a deep technical understanding of what they're dealing with and what the market is.
Right.
And I think they didn't have that before, and they do now, and I think that's a great thing. So I'm happy to see the changes and see the changes that these new ideas they have, and I'm just crossing my fingers that they can actually do it.
Yeah.
So we'll know within a year. I think we'll know.
All right. Sounds good. All right, I'm going to wrap it up and stop the recording. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this FMDiSC meeting, and we will see you all next month.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate. Oh, wait, before we go, I forgot.
So, do you want me to stop recording, or you
No,
want to...
yeah, stop recording because I don't want everybody. This is just for FMDiSC.